is. Romans chapter 13. Started it last week. We went through the first 4 verses and talked about government and how Christians are supposed to respond to government, whether good or bad. And the response is the same. It doesn't matter. We're supposed to respond to government as obedient servants. And the only time that we can possibly justify disobeying our government is if it deliberately goes against God's word, personally. Now, the government makes laws and allows things that we don't agree with and that are sinful and wrong, but we're not to rise up in violence or anything of that nature to fight it. The way we fight evil is with good. So we pray and we witness and we try to change the people's hearts, because that's the problem anyway. If we have a bad government, if we have an evil government that is against us, I mean not against us, but against Christians, but causing us problems and doing damage to our land, it's because we're under the judgment of God. Because, as we talked about 1 through 4, God has installed every leader in the world. That every leader of every nation, God is the one who instituted them into power. God created them for that power. God raised them up to that power. We're going to see that a little more today, because we stopped at 4, 5, 6, and 7. It's still talking about that same thing. And so we talked about it pretty extensively, so we'll just talk about it a little more. I'll go ahead and read 5 through 7. It says, "Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake." So, again, Paul is talking about to the government, to those in rule over them. And Paul, during his day, they were in bondage to Rome. They were under Roman bondage, I guess. The Romans had control over Israel. And so what Paul says and what Christ says both is that it's not your job to resist, and it's not your job to fight back. That if you resist, you're not resisting Rome, you're not resisting the government, you're resisting God, because he's the one that placed them there. God is the one that placed our rulers there. So what are we supposed to do? Be obedient servants, because that's what Christians are called to be. Obedient servants. We never get above the class of servant. We're supposed to be examples to the whole earth. That our whole purpose is to glorify God by our service to God and to man. And so, for us to resist and to go against these rulers is to go against God. And it says, let me just read through 1 through 7, because it just make more sense if we read it all together. "So let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." And again, Rome is ruling over Israel. So they have bondmen over them. So he's not talking about the temple. He's not talking about good Jewish kings. He's talking about the Roman rulers that's ruling their land at this time. He's talking to everybody in any time with any government, good or evil. They're ordained by God. And if they're evil, it's because of punishment. And so instead of resisting them, we are to pray for them and pray for our people, because when we get ourselves right, then God will fix the government. Because God's the one who puts them there. God, He Believe it or not, God has been preparing Joe Biden for this very day. I mean, that sounds kind of comical, but God truly has raised him up for this day. And he did Donald Trump, and he did Barack Obama, and he did Bill Clinton, and he did George Bush, and every other president that we've ever had, and every other king that's ever been, and every other ruler that's ever been. God has ordained them to serve his purpose. Because in the end, and this is what we got to understand, God truly is sovereign, and all things from time beginning to time end are going to work for the glory of God. Everything, every life, everything, whether they go to heaven or hell, they will result in the glory of God. Verse 2 says, whosoever therefore resisteth the power, talking about the governmental powers, resisteth the ordinance of God. And they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister, who? The governmental official. Believe it or not, the government official, whether good or evil, is a minister of God. It doesn't mean that they are a servant of God or they are even a Christian, because most of them are not, as we well know. But they are a minister, which means servant of God, because God is using them to accomplish his purpose. That God has brought them to the position that they're at to accomplish his divine sovereign will. That God's plan cannot be altered. That the enemy, the devil, can do anything he wants, but it's going to go exactly to plan, and everything's going to happen just exactly as God has told us in his word, as the Bible has proved over and over and over and over again. Nothing can thwart it. We can see the enemy throughout the centuries trying to destroy the Jews, trying to destroy the Bibles through people like Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, and it could not be accomplished. But that even in the devil's ridiculous rebellion to try to destroy the people of God, he actually accomplished the will of God. Because Israel was not a nation for 1,800 years. And no people has ever kept their identity after being out of their land for more than 400 years. But the Jews kept their identity for 1,800 years. And they were scattered throughout the whole world. But God had promised in his word that the Jews would come back to their land, that the temple would be rebuilt, and that all these things would happen. We can see in the book of Revelation, all this stuff has to happen. So 1,800 years of them being scattered throughout the world, you would say, well, they're not even a people anymore. That they've been scattered throughout the world. They've obviously acclimated to every culture that they've ever been into, like every other nation that's been scattered. But they didn't. That is a miracle in itself, that the Jews kept their identity, being scattered throughout the whole world for 1,800 years. And then God actually put Adolf Hitler into power to accomplish the divine will of God of bringing Israel to be a nation again, which was an impossibility. It was absolutely impossible for man, but with God all things are possible. And so he proves to us miraculously, just looking at it, that God really is in control. And he is sovereign over even Adolf Hitler and even over the devil himself. So it says, for he is the minister of God to thee for good, but if thou do that which is evil, be afraid. God tells us to be afraid. If you do wickedly in your country, you should be afraid of your government. You should be afraid of your government officials. You should be afraid of your law enforcement. For he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God. Again, he calls him the minister of God, which means servant. That he is accomplishing the will of God, that God uses He puts into place government officials throughout the whole world to accomplish his will and to control the people to an extent that he causes these leaders to keep people from living to the full wickedness of their own hearts. That can you imagine if there was no government officials, if there was no police force, as people in our land have tried to do? Can you imagine? And we see that. We see the ones that have decreased the police population and tried to defund them altogether, like in Oregon, Portland. You can see the absolute self-destruction. You can see the chaos and the confusion and the rioting and the crime. It is absolutely uninhibited. The rapes and the murders, that there's nobody to protect them. Well, guess who put the law enforcement there? God. Guess who put the government there? God. To protect us and to restrain men to a certain extent. They are truly the ministers of God. God is using them to keep us safe. Now, we see, like in China, that the government actually works against Christians, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But still, God has ordained their government. And what has happened now that their government has banned Christianity and persecuting the church, it's the fastest growing church in the whole world. That in China is the fastest growing church in the whole world. So even though they have a wicked, evil ruler that is condemning the church and fighting against the church, the persecuted church is the fastest growing church in the whole world. And again, that's what I said, that we have to comply to our government rules and standards and laws as long as they don't go against the Word of God. That's the only time that we are justified in rebelling against our own government. To finish 4, for he beareth not the sword in vain, for he is the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. And so that's where we stop. So now 5, I'm going to go ahead and read through 7. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. So we not only subject ourselves to the governmental authorities and their laws as obedient servants and subjects, because that's what we're called to be. We do it for that, to not suffer the wrath of the government which God has ordained, but also for conscience sake, because we are ambassadors for Christ. And Christ is our example, and he showed us how we were to respond even to foreign invaders that have overtaken our government and are ruling over us and are not that kind to us. But how did Christ respond to the Romans? With love and generosity, and we'll talk about that in a minute, even the taxes and everything that Jesus told them. Are we supposed to pay taxes? Yes. You pay taxes, and we'll talk about that here in a minute because it talks about that. So, in the next verse, for this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. So here, it's even talking about, and it'll talk about custom here in a minute too, and those are almost the same thing. It's hard to tell what the difference is really. But tribute for sure is, Rome required tribute. Everybody they conquered, they would require the people of the lands to pay them tribute. It's just like taxes, I guess. It's essentially is taxes, but they didn't make their own people pay it. But every land they conquered, they would make them pay tribute. And so Paul tells us, for this cause pay you tribute also, for they are God's ministers. What does that mean? Attending continually upon this very thing. That even the taxes, because, man, this steps on toes, I understand. Christians, you hear them all the time, people Christians, talking about our high taxes and taxes going up and everything else. But what does Christ say?
Render to Caesar what is Caesar.
Exactly. Keep your mouth shut and pay your taxes. Because, believe it or not, and this is hard to believe, but our taxes and our tribute and our customs that we're paying, even the Jews paying to the Romans, is ordained by God for them to accomplish His sovereign will. That's true. That God was the one who ordained Rome, Nero and Tiberius and all those other Caesars. He's the one who ordained them to bring Israel into bondage. And then He caused them to have to pay tribute to Rome to accomplish His will even further. And so He's saying, God has placed them there, and the money that you're giving them is, God is going to use that money to accomplish His will. And so, for you, just to be subject to that and pay what is theirs. It's not yours anyway. It's God's. And so, it is eventually going to bring God glory. That God is going to accomplish His will even through your taxes that you hate paying. Just pay them. Don't fight against it. One of my, I love, what is his name? Oh, I love him. He's a good teacher. No. Kent Hovind. Kent Hovind. Brilliant Bible scholar. Brilliant Bible scholar. I mean, he goes through it at 100 miles an hour. Just amazing. He does some a little bit of apologetics to do some debates. Brilliant. But he got the idea that it was unbiblical for him to pay taxes. And so he stopped paying taxes. And he spent 8 years in prison. He's out now, and his ministry started back up. But he could have got out of prison, but he would not quit fighting it, because he said it was unconstitutional and it was unbiblical for him to pay those taxes. But that's the opposite of what the Bible tells us to do. We're not here to necessarily get ahead in this life. We're not here necessarily to obtain a lot of things or wealth. We may be here to live a life of poverty. We may be taxed to death. The important thing is that we're obedient to God in everything we do. And if God tells us that we are just to pay the tribute and the taxes and whatever without bitterness and without resentment and without backbiting, then that's what we're supposed to do, and that's what we need to do. He said, and I'll finish this, then I want to talk a little more about it. He says, verse 7, "Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and honor to whom honor." And so I was thinking about that today, and Pharaoh and every other national leader that was and is unknowingly, maybe unknowingly, the ministers of God. God uses those He puts in charge to accomplish His holy will. Even our taxes and the riches given to the governments, although they may use some of the taxes and money for evil means, but God is still the one who blesses them with it to accomplish His will. So even though our government may use part of our taxes for abortion, there's nothing we can do about that except pray. We can't stop paying taxes because the Bible tells us not to stop paying taxes. We can't just say, hey, we're not going to pay your taxes anymore. What we need to do is pray to God, go out, speak to the people, try to win them to the Lord and show them how evil and wicked this truly is. And then when we seek God and humble ourselves, then He will heal our land. He will change the people's hearts. And so that's our response. And so even when they're using taxes, because let me tell you, when Jesus told Peter and told the other ones that to render to Caesar what is Caesar's, Rome was doing horrible, wicked things with their tax money, with their tribute money. They were torturing Jews. They were killing Jews. They were actually committing abortions in that day. I don't know if you know that. But they were committing quite a bit of abortions in the day of Christ in Rome. And so they were doing all kinds of wicked things with the tribute money that the Jews were giving them. But Jesus and Paul both said, you just pay what is due them, because they are ordained and put there by God to accomplish His will. And if they use the money for evil, then they will give an account. And it's not for you to say, well, I'm not going to pay the taxes. But we just allow God to deal with it, and God will deal with it. That if they are using your money for abortions and so forth, they will individually be held accountable for what they did for that money. But still, God is going to accomplish His will in the end. They will give an account, just as we all will, for how they use the money. God is in control. God knows exactly who to raise up that will make their own free will decisions to ultimately accomplish God's will. I was thinking, was it here that I was talking about middle knowledge? That middle knowledge of God? No. I don't really want to get into it. But so anyway, there's a thing called middle knowledge. And it's hard to explain. But what it means is that God knows every decision. God knows that if He proposed every single option to you, He knows in every single one of those options, in every single second, the decision that you'll make in every one of those options. You understand? Like, okay, right now, God could present me in this second right now with, just say, 50 options. God could have somebody come through that front door, and He knows exactly how I'm going to react. Or let's say they had a gun. God knows if they came in that door and they had a gun, He knows exactly how I'm going to react. If they say a certain thing, He knows exactly how I'm going to react. If they come through this door, He knows exactly how I'm going to react. Okay, so do you see what I'm saying? In this 1 second, God can create 50 scenarios that He can introduce, and He knows exactly what I'm going to do in every single one of them. And so I still have a free will choice in every one of them. But He puts it in place to accomplish His will, the exact scenario where He needs me to get to. Amen. This is so unfathomable when you think about 7.2 billion people in the world, and God's doing it to all of them. But just like Adolf Hitler, to get to the point he did, God had to orchestrate millions of people every second of every day to get him to that point. I can't really explain this. It's really hard. So, what I'm saying is, in God's sovereignty, why I'm saying it like this is because there's several ways to look at it. Is like the Calvinist view, where we don't have a free will, and like God ordains us to do things and makes us do things and ordains us to be saved or not to be saved. Okay, so that's like the lack of free will. So then there's the Arminius way, and that's where we have the free will to choose, different options as they're presented. But then there's the middle knowledge, and this is where it gets kind of hard to understand, but the middle knowledge is where God still gives each and every one of us a free will, but His divine sovereign plan is going to work out because He knows every position that every person needs to be to get Pharaoh to office. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's hard to grasp, hard to fathom, but like, God is the one, God told Pharaoh, he said, I'm the one that brought you up. I exalted you. It took a lot of people's lives to get Pharaoh to that point. It took a lot of God's working out in thousands of people's lives to get him to that point. He never took away anybody's free will. But God knew who to put where and the decisions they would make to get Pharaoh from there to here to accomplish his will. Does that make sense?
It's like he sets up the stepping stone.
Yeah. But
Like when we cross a river or creek, we set up stones, or there's stones already in the river for us to walk across.
yeah.
God does that with people as well. He sets them up as like stepping stones to cross, or to bridge the gap to where we need to be from where we're wanting to be.
Yes. But he does it on an infinite scale.
Yes, we can only fathom a small amount.
He does it every second of the day with billions of people.
Yeah, he has no limit.
I mean,
we have a limit, and even in our thought, we have a limit. So
Yeah.
we can't fathom
No.
how much power God really has.
No, and that's this is, I know it's hard, this is hard to grasp and hard to understand, which we can't really understand it, but we can know how it works. But the reason it's important for us to understand is because we have a bad habit of like putting God in a box. And when you start to understand these deep things of God and like how powerful, how omniscient and how omnipotent, all power and all knowledge, how truly true that is, when you start to see that God is affecting every life on this planet, and that God is orchestrating billions of things, I don't know how you'd say it, billions of scenarios, I guess, all over the planet, every second of every day to accomplish his final divine will. That's amazing. Like even the Antichrist. Like even the rise of the Antichrist is a miraculous event. And we read the story and we know, the Antichrist is going to rise through the ranks and the Antichrist is going to rule the world, and there's going to be one world currency, there's going to be one world religion, and he's going to rule the world with an iron fist. Like nobody will go against him. And you're not going to be able to buy and sell unless you have his mark and all this. We know all this, and we tend to hear that story, read the story, and think about the story all as like the devil rising him to power. No. God is the one who ordained this story. God is the one who foretold this story. God is the one who's going to rise him through the ranks. It's God who is the source of all power. Amen. And God is going to have his divine plan worked out to the last detail. And again, it's not that God is causing evil, because there is no darkness in God. But God will use the devil and all his forces to accomplish his end goal. That the devil, all the wicked men that's ever lived, will bring God glory. Amen. That everything that's ever been in the end will be for the glory of God. Even the Pharaoh of Egypt, still to this day, that wicked man that was so hard on the Jews and killed so many of them, that they still talk about him, not because he was some great man or not because he was such an evil man, but because God received full glory in his life. You see what I'm saying? That even in the end, the devil, when he bows before Christ and confesses him as Lord, that he is going to bring God the ultimate glory, because he will not have won anything. He is going to see on that day, just like every other person that has rejected Christ, they're going to see on that day that Christ was the purpose of it all. And that it was all for His glory. And that even our rejection of Him, if you don't receive Him, that you're casting away into damnation, brings God glory. Because He is the creator of all things. I was talking to Mom, there was a guy, I had a post today about when we die and go to heaven, I said, I think we'll see our lives, we'll see in all of our lives, we're going to see all those hard times, and those times we just didn't think we was going to make it, just we was really struggling. I think we'll see all of our life, and I think we'll see that Christ was actually right there with us. And He was actually holding us through those times when we were just about to give up. And I think we're going to see, maybe we weren't aware at the time because we just felt alone, and maybe you just felt like you weren't going to make it, but you're going to see that Jesus was actually right there with you. And He actually carried you through that time. And I had a person respond and say, well, if we really remembered that and saw that, would it be heaven? And then, anyway, it's something else. And I responded, I said, when we get to heaven, our memories ain't going to be erased. When we get to heaven, our memories ain't going to be just washed away. And we're still going to have every memory. We're still going to remember everything. But we're going to have a clear and perfect mind. That when we get to heaven, we're not going to see things like we see it now. Like now, when we lose a loved one, we're so hurt, we're so devastated, we can't understand. And maybe you even get mad at God and you say, why did you take him, God? But when you're in heaven, you're not going to see it that way. When we're here and we're suffering and we have pain, maybe we have a disease, maybe we have suffer hunger or financially, and we're just, when you're going through it, you just can't see any good out of this. But when you get to heaven, you're going to see perfectly clear, and you're going to see the whole of God's plan in your life. And then you're going to say, well, that was for the glory of God. I'm here now, and I can see all this, even my failures, even when I failed, even when I sinned, and God chastised me, then, that is for the glory of God. We'll see that God's working. We'll see God's working through every one of those. It just amazes me how people think that, like, heaven is for us. Like, we're here for our enjoyment and our pleasure, and that God's here for our enjoyment and our pleasure. But no, heaven's for God. Heaven's for the worship of God. We're here for the glory of God. If you think that God's here for us, that's humanism. That's everything. God is here for our pleasure and our happiness and our joy. No, we're here for the glory of God. Amen. We're here because He has pleasure in us and He loves us, and He created us for that very purpose, to glorify Him. But when we get to heaven, it's all going to be about God. We're going to see everything as it should be. We're going to see our whole lives. We're going to see all of our lives for the glory of God. We're going to see every step of our way, even when we fail and we got up, and we fail and we got up. We're going to see all of that was for the glory of God, that He was sanctifying us and preparing us to get us there, and He was glorifying His name in us. That any good that we did, anything that we did, any testimony, any witnessing you've done for somebody, anybody that you led to the Lord, you're going to see that was for the glory of God. It's all for the glory of God. And again, these governments are put into place for the glory of God. He's going to accomplish His will. And so when we get to heaven, we're going to see things perfectly and clearly as He does. We're going to have the mind of Christ, and we're going to see everything for the reason that it really was. And we're not going to look back at our lives with pain. We're not going to look back at our lives with any kind of suffering, or you're not even going to look back at it at this point with any shame. Because you're going to be made perfect. You're going to have the perfect mind of Christ. You're not going to have any sin. You're not going to look through these sinful eyes. You're not going to think with these sinful brains. You're not going to see through this temporary suffering bodies, but you're going to see everything for the actual purpose that it was. And you're going to say, man, that time I suffered right there, like really bad, like I lost somebody really close to me. You're going to see millions of results of that event for the glory of God. Everything in life is for the glory of God. Even the devil and all his work is going to be accomplished for the glory of God. God uses governments to judge men, and God uses governments to bless men. But it is God who puts them in place. God who ordains them to accomplish his final will. And so what I'm trying to say is it's all for the glory of God. And so when we live under a government, good or evil, we live in the same way. We live good. And we live in subjection as long as it don't go against God's word. And we are ambassadors of Christ. Why? For the glory of God. Because that's our purpose, that's our goal, is to bring him honor and glory. I hope that's making sense. I feel like I've rambled some, but I hope you understand what I'm trying to say. So we are to do everything that we can do to be subject and to be servants for the Lord and for our fellow man. Let's go on to verse 8. Now he's going to tell us so he's told us how we respond to government powers. And again, he's talking about secular government powers. At the time, he was talking about Roman power over them. And so he's not talking about good rulers. He's talking about good or bad rulers. So now he's going to talk about our relationship with other men, other people. Again, good or bad. We're not responsible for how they treat us. We're responsible for how we treat them. Same way with the government. We're not responsible for a good or bad government. We're responsible for how we respond to that government. And so we always are to respond with goodness and love and mercy, patience and obedience. And so with man, it's the same way. Not so much obedience, but with goodness and love. It says, owe no man anything, but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. So he starts out, owe no man anything. It tells us several times throughout the Scriptures, Old Testament and New Testament, that when you borrow money, that you are a slave to the lender. And especially when it's not like a banking situation or whatever, but it's an individual, you borrow money, and especially in friendships, that's going to affect the relationship. And God says it's best not to ever even go into that realm. That if you need something, save your money, and I know that's not the American way, and I'm in debt. I owe for my house and everything, but that's not the true biblical way. We shouldn't be in debt so much because it does put us into bondage. Because I'm now liable to the bank until I get that debt paid. And so God is never limited, but just excuse my expression before I even use it. God is limited how much he could use me because of the debt that I'm in, if that makes sense. That I have essentially kind of tied the hands of God a little bit in what I can do because I am in bondage to the lender. So does that make sense? Like I can't just pick up and go off to the mission field because I have a responsibility to the lender. I am a slave to the lender. I have to go to my job. I have to work to pay the lender. I can't just bounce around and, Anyway, I'm not saying, don't take it out of context what I'm saying. All right. Owe no man nothing, but to love one another. That's the core of it all. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. And Jesus spoke about this. He condensed the law, the 613 laws of Moses. Jesus condensed them down to 2. To love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love thy neighbor as thyself. And Paul is just going to reiterate the second one because he's talking about your relationship with other people. He says in verse 9, for this, talking about the law, the fulfilling of the law, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. And if there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, namely, thou shalt never love thy neighbor as thyself. So, what does all those commandments have in common? Thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. What does all those commandments have in common? They deal with our fellow man. They deal with our relationship to our fellow man. They deal with us hurting our fellow man. That if we commit adultery, we're hurting a lot of people. We're not only hurting our spouse, but we're hurting the person that we're committing adultery with, and it doesn't end there. We're hurting our spouse's whole entire family. We're hurting our whole entire family. The other person, we're hurting their whole entire family. This is a snowball effect that affects a whole lot more than just 2 people committing this heinous act. So this is affecting a whole lot of people. But again, it's affecting your neighbor. Thou shalt not kill. Of course, that's going to affect your neighbor and all of their family, all of your family. Again, this is just a snowball. Thou shalt not steal. That again is directly, deliberately hurting your fellow man. Thou shalt not bear false witness. Same. Thou shalt not covet. So Paul is telling us how serious it is for us to love our neighbor. That sounds so simple, yet people can't seem to grasp this. Because, again, this is not only pertaining to those who love you or other Christians. Morally, it's not. It's how we respond to the world. It's to people that are hostile towards us. It's to people that hate us. It's to those, it's to all those people that are against us and trying to maybe even cause us harm. How are we supposed to respond? With love, just like with our government. It's our response is always love. So God is love, and that's how we are to respond. And so he says at the end, namely, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Then he says, love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Again, he doesn't say whether they be good or bad, or whether they're good to you or not good to you. But love worketh no ill to his neighbor. We don't respond to their negativity. We respond in love. We fight evil with good. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. That if we truly set our hearts and minds to loving God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and loving our neighbor as ourselves, we won't sin against God. We won't sin against other people. So we won't sin at all. If we fulfill those 2 commandments, we won't sin at all. We won't sin. And so that's why we need to set our hearts to fulfilling these laws, to love our neighbor as ourselves, whether they're good or bad. It doesn't matter. It's irregardless of their behavior. We're only responsible for our behavior.
Yeah, it don't say love your good neighbor.
No, because most neighbors are not good. And this is, the government, he was under Roman bondage. Again, so that's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. Verse 11, and that knowing the time, that now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now is our salvation nearer than when we believed. The night is far spent, the day is at hand. Let us therefore cast off the works of darkness, and let us put the armor of light. Let us walk honestly, as in the day, not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, not in strife and envying, but put ye on the Lord Jesus Christ, and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill the lust thereof. So again, Paul's just, in the whole chapter 13, he's dealing with our response to the government, whether it be good or bad, and our response to our neighbors, whether it be good or bad. Our response is always the same: in love and obedience,